Hello and welcome to Speed Bumps with Charlie Kimball. I'll be your host, Charlie Kimball, and I would ask that our audience joins me in extending a nice warm welcome to Dr. David Ferguson. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Human Performance, I believe, at Michigan State University. Dr. Ferguson's research has been at the forefront of understanding molecular mechanisms, and say that 3 times fast, that drive increased cardiovascular function. We're going to ask him what that means. In addition to his academic pursuits, he leads groundbreaking research aimed at enhancing both the safety and performance of racing drivers. This dual focus reflects his commitment to bridging the gap between fundamental science and real-world applications, ensuring that his work has a tangible benefits for athletes and the human race. His work holds personal significance for me. As an IndyCar race driver managing type 1 diabetes, I've benefited from his insights, research, and frankly, his blunt perspectives on improving my performance since 2011. Moreover, Dr. Ferguson's expertise shines through in his role as the author of The Science of Motorsports. You can find that wherever you get books, Amazon, and across the world in bookstores, because within its pages, he delves into the intricate interplay of physiological, psychological, and sports medical factors that shape performance in motor racing. Let us embrace the opportunity to learn from his wealth of knowledge and experience as we welcome Dr. David Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, thank you for being on the show.
Charlie, thanks so much for the wonderful, eloquent welcome. I do not deserve it, but I greatly appreciate it.
I tell you, just as I told some of my previous guests, ChatGPT does a great job making me look like a good writer. Because I am not.
I'm going to have to start using that at some point. But I'm so happy to be here.
Well, and we'll talk a little bit about AI if we get to it later on, because as a professor, I think that's really interesting, and how you ask your students to use it, but also like how you control how much they use it and why.
Yeah.
But back to us. Yep. We first met at Texas A&M, Gig'em, back in 2011. You reached out to my team through my website, and you were working on your doctorate at the time. And I believe your doctorate thesis was on the genetic regulation of physical activity. Now, how then and why were you interested in motorsports, racing drivers as athletes, and frankly, more specifically, as me as a racing driver?
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question with a very roundy road answer in a bit. So, if we're going to have a conversation about racing, it's obviously that I would be passionate about cars, racing. I like to say I tried to drive a car quickly. I refuse to say I drove race cars, because talking to someone like you, it's just not the same. But I've always been passionate about cars. I like sports cars, I like fast cars. And, there was a plan at one point where I was going to go to medical school, become a surgeon, and there might have been a plan that I was going to use the money as a physician and surgeon to buy expensive cars. I think people have done that well. And I kind of had a reality check moment where I realized that you should probably do what you're passionate about. And, being passionate about cars, passionate about the human body, I'd seen instances where drivers had really fatigued in the car. And I was like, why so much effort is going into the engineering of the car? And you know what that is, and you could probably share a lot of details on what it takes to actually engineer a very fast race car. No one's looking at the driver. And this was 2005, 2006. We've got a long way since then, but no one was doing it then. So I found a guy named Tim Lightfoot, who was at the time at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, who was kind of doing a little bit of work in NASCAR. I was like, can I come do a master's with you? And he said, yep, come on. So we did a project with NASCAR that was a lot of fun, and we can talk details about that, about what we did. And then if you kind of remember that time period, that was 2007, 2008, when the economy tanked. And, the finances of race teams. A race team was not going to employ a physiologist when they were trying to find people to build engines, suspensions, and, drive race cars. So Tim kind of said, hey, why don't you do a PhD? You like the research side of things. You're good at it. And I was like, yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't I do that? And he says, well, there's kind of two catches to it. One is, I'm moving to Texas A&M, so you'd better come with me if you want to do it with me. So I'm like, I guess I'm going to Texas. And the second thing he said was, and I hold him to this, and I hope he listens to this podcast because he's going to be, I'm saying it right now. He said, it's going to be really hard to make a research career in motorsports. You should probably do something related more to health, chronic disease, probably not going to get a grant in motorsports. We will come back and discuss if that happened or not.
Well, and I'm going to pause there because that sounds very similar, and I know Dr. Lightfoot very well. An incredible researcher, and has been an incredible mentor to you as an exercise physiologist, as a researcher. And to me, it sounds a little like my parents' advice when I was in high school and racing. They said, I want to make sure you can get into college, so when this racing career doesn't work out, you can get a real job one day. Yep. And like you said, I try not to remind them of that more than once or twice a week.
Oh, well, so I'll tell you this anecdotal story. There was another anecdote to that story where we tested a young NASCAR driver that came to the lab, and we didn't talk about the test we've done. You've been through. We did a VO2 max test, which is you put someone on a treadmill and you make them run basically to exhaustion. And this person did great.
Yes, you do.
Yep, and you know it. And I was like, this person did great. He was just getting kind of starting his NASCAR career. I was like, I know this guy's going to be a big hit. He's going to make it huge. And I'm telling Dr. Lightfoot this. And he said, I don't know, David. Like, there are so many people that come into racing that never go anywhere. He goes, probably in 10 years, you won't know the name Jimmy Johnson. So...
And for maybe some of our listeners that aren't race fans, Jimmy Johnson has won seven championships.
Yep.
Yeah. 7-time Jimmy Johnson. Yep. Also had a very, very strong run in IndyCar. So you might not know his name if you have never watched a motorsports race in the last 20 years.
Exactly. If you've avoided racing for the last 20 years, you don't know who he is. Otherwise, he's now a Hall of Famer, I believe. I think he was inducted to the Hall of Fame, and I believe he was. So, well, without badgering Tim too much, because he is a great mentor and a great friend of mine, he encouraged me to get to your question was to kind of study something that's a little bit more mainstream, which was the genetic regulation of physical activity. So we know...
What does that mean?
That's a great point. Let's see if I can remember my original doctoral thesis now. We know that being physically active, going out and, you can call it the set number of steps, exercise, whatever it may be. If you're physically active, you will decrease your incidence of obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all these things. But a very, very small percent of the population meets the physical activity guidelines. And so there have been hundreds of millions of dollars spent on research to try and figure out why that is and try to intervene to get there. And at the time, again, this is the early to mid 2000s, there was like, well, what if you had genes to be active? What if those genes determine how active you're going to be? You have genes that, determine the color of your hair, color of your eyes, how much muscle mass you have. What if it determines your physical activity? So my dissertation, my initial work focused on genes and skeletal muscle that if you had them, it made it easier for you to be active. So we did a series of studies. We did this in mice. We couldn't do this in humans at the time, where we switched the genetic makeup of high active and low active mice. We made low active mice high active mice low active, and it confirmed that, if you have these genes, it will influence your physical activity. So
your confirmation, if the research in mice translates to humans, would say that conclusion you could draw is that just like there are people that are genetically predisposed to type 1 diabetes, to type 2 diabetes, to high cholesterol, to cardiovascular challenges, there are people that are predisposed to be active and genetically predisposed to be more or less active or more sedentary.
Absolutely. I would say absolutely correct. They are predisposed, not predestined. There are still ways to push that and go into different conditions. But absolutely. So that's what our data show.
I like that, predisposed versus predestined,
Absolutely.
because had a conversation recently on this podcast, and I think the word choice and perspective is very important. She said she chooses to respond, not react.
Yes.
And so being predisposed rather than predestined is a response, right? You're predisposed to it, but it does not pigeonhole you in a life or in a reduced activity during your life.
Mhm.
You can work against that disposition.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, and we can kind of talk, I still sort of have that line of research. It's moved kind of a little bit over to look at more how nutrition influences things. But it's really true. Like, just because you have this genetic makeup does not mean you're not going to be active or not be an elite athlete. You still got to put the work in. So,
right.
And yes, so we did a series of great studies.
I'm gonna interrupt you again, because I think there are, personally, I believe there are like racing drivers historically that have had more talent.
Yep.
And so therefore aren't used to putting the work in to get those skills developed, right?
Mhm.
So if you're predisposed to be active, you're just naturally more active.
Yep.
You may not be as prepared to put the work in to be an elite athlete,
Yep.
right? You have to have a baseline of talent or a baseline of
Yep.
activity, but that X factor, that last
Yep.
0.5% comes down to time in the gym, in the simulator, with the engineers, all that sort of thing, with your coaches, if you're outside motorsports. How very interesting those translations between talent and genetic predisposition and that disposition versus predestined, and being able to put the work in and train that practice.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think, you talked about the human performance stuff. I always say, I want to work with an athlete that has a lot of heart and cardiovascularly fit, but also the drive to do it. I don't think this is this type of podcast, but you and I could probably sit here and list a lot of drivers that had a lot of talent and didn't go very far because they didn't want to put the work in. But yeah, it's the same.
And I think there are a lot of drivers that you look back and go, oh man, like they weren't maybe naturally as capable.
Yeah.
But they won world championships. They won Indy 500s. They had incredible careers and are legends in their own right, maybe even Hall of Famers. And I'm not talking about Jimmy Johnson. I'm making no references there, but maybe even Hall of Famers, because they worked so hard to put that, you talk about that 10,000 hour mark, that 20,000, hundreds of thousands of hours in the gym, with coaches, all of those things. So why me? Why were you interested in me? And why did we get an email from you in 2011? I think it was maybe late May after my rookie season at the Indy 500, early June. We got an email and my dad goes, "Hey, this is interesting. Like, maybe go down and see this guy."
Yeah. So, well, we can talk all about that first visit. I think there's some good stories to share there.
Yeah.
So, I'll start with, as a physiologist, we talk about human performance. We talk about what the athlete is doing, whether they're running, sprinting, shooting a basketball, whatever they're doing, their muscle is executing an action. And that muscle needs to be fueled, just like a car engine needs to be fueled. If you don't have the gas tank or a working fuel pump, that car is not going to go. So, I'm not sure how much you've gone into what type 1 diabetes is on this, but if you're type 1 diabetic, you actually have trouble getting fuel, which is glucose, into your working muscle. And, so as a physiologist, we always look at how we're going to get glucose into the muscle, how we're going to fuel the muscle to do what we need to do. And, I was kind of at this transition phase where I'd done a lot of stuff in NASCAR. I'd kind of come to Texas A&M. I was still trying to do some motorsport stuff. And I was sort of noodling this idea of, how do you make the ultimate race car driver athlete? And you're going to see where this is going to go in a second. And part of that was, getting fuel to the athlete. And we can go back, but kind of 2010, 2011, the idea of drink bottles or Gatorade and stuff in the car it was kind of there, but not really. And so, we talked about me being a car guy. I've always been an IndyCar fan. Like, you can talk about different forms of race. I love all forms of racing now. I've had the benefit of working all, but I'm an IndyCar guy. I grew up with IndyCar in the 90s when it was 1,000 horsepower, when the Penske's were breaking all the records at 500. IndyCar is the end-all be-all for me. Other drivers I work with are going to be very angry with what I just said, but that's okay. I love IndyCar. I think it's one of the last great, grip it and rip it, driving experiences. When you drive an IndyCar, you are driving a monster. And you can talk more about that than I can.
And it's raw, right? You talk about those 1,000 horsepower turbos screaming, and I actually talked to previous guest Allison about the visceral feeling of the Indy 500, right?
Yeah.
And look, it just gives me goosebumps talking about it because it is raw. It is that pure competition and almost a total competition element in IndyCar. So I get it. You're preaching to the choir with me. I get it, Dr. Ferguson.
So
as an IndyCar fan,
I'm watching the Indy 500. And they do a spotlight on you, and they say, Charlie Kimball is a type 1 diabetic. He measures his blood glucose on his steering, something in the car. I'm not sure if it was on the wheel at that point or if you had like your...
Well, through the high-tech science of Velcro, it was on the steering wheel,
yes. It was Velcroed on there. And I sat there, and I'm like, that's odd. I'm like, how's he doing that? What's he doing? Like, now at the time, there was good information on type 1 athletes in other sports, such as like cycling was a big one, running was another one. And they sort of had these recommendations about what you had to do, how to manage it, and what kind of the right way to do it was. And I'm kind of running through those in my head at the time. And I'm like, I don't think you can do those in a race car. You can't give someone carbohydrates really well. You can't really monitor glucose with a finger stick like you're supposed to. Like the books used to say, do the finger stick. And so I was like, I kind of just sat there and just thought about that. Like, that's interesting. And so it sat in my head all day, every day for about 4 days, at which point I finally said, I'm going to email this guy. I just want to know. And at the time, you were with Chip Ganassi Racing, and the NASCAR project I had just done was with his NASCAR team, Chip Ganassi Racing and NASCAR. So I wrote the email kind of like, I think I said something along the lines of, I'm not a fan. I'm not looking to get anything from you. I've got a connection to Ganassi. Can I please just talk to you about this stuff? Because I think I know how to either make you perform better, but also maybe make drivers safer. I went to go look and find the email. I was going to read it, and it's in an email address I haven't accessed in like decades, so I have to find it. But
I love that you tried, though.
If we have time, I pulled some old things that I was going to share on the podcast. Here we go. But so that was it. And I sent the email, and I didn't expect to really get a response. I thought it was going to be, you got hundreds of those. I'm not going to waste my time with this. And I think at first your dad said, why don't you give this guy a call or respond? And
so the way I remember it was right after the 500, and I was exhausted mentally, physically, emotionally. It was a big month. And maybe a week or two later, my dad goes, hey, I got this email from, he's an exercise physiologist. He's studying and training at Texas A&M, but he was in North Carolina and did a program with Chip Ganassi's NASCAR team. Let me talk to him, see what it's about. Emailed him back and forth. And he goes, hey, I think this could really help. Like, I was trying to figure out how, especially in that first year, I was following my endocrinologist's guidelines of blood sugar, right? For her, she was more worried about me going low and what's called hypoglycemic, low blood sugar, lightheaded, fainting, passing out, causing an accident. So we were running hyperglycemic compared to what I should be. So I was running higher blood sugar than what I would normally be. And so we weren't really talking. We were talking performance. I was in the gym. I was like destroying my body, trying to get stronger. It felt like some days I was destroying it. Jim and Jim Leo Pitfit, my trainer. You know how hard he pushes us. And when you're training with other racing drivers, you push yourselves really hard. And I wasn't really thinking about glycemic control, my blood glucose number, as a performance element. And so I was like, yeah, why not? And I had been speaking for my sponsor at the time a lot. And I think I flew from Boston or somewhere like that down to Texas, drove down to College Station. Actually think I maybe flew into College Station, tiny little airport. Apparently now it's all jet service, which is like
it's
the
massive
modern era.
now. Like it's huge.
Oh.
Yeah.
So flew into College Station, came and saw you guys, saw Dr. Lightfoot, saw you. You pulled in a couple other people, and I'm hoping to get him on the podcast. But Dr. Jim Fluckey, he had done a lot of work with endurance athletes, cyclists, ultra marathoners with type 1, and what that fueling of an athlete looks like in a like 2, 3, 4, 5 hour event. And so I went through and I show up and you're like, okay, just bring workout clothes. And I was like, yeah, fine. Okay. I do that anyways. Like it's always in my bag, it seems like. So you ran me through and said, okay, we're going to do a VO2 test. We're going to do a DEXA scan and look at your bone density, body fat percent, water percent, like whatever else was there. And I think we did the VO2, we did the DEXA.
Do we do the Wingate on the first trial?
I think the first trip we only did those two, but we spent a lot of time talking.
Yeah, we talked a lot. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, we talk a lot every time we get together.
That's true.
It seems
That's
like
true.
it's 2 or 3 hours. Yeah. But I remember being like, okay, these guys know their stuff, right? They know how the bodies work. And as the son of an engineer and a nerd myself, I loved learning how the body worked, how the pathways for glucose from that, piece of fruit that I eat ends up fueling a muscle for me to go hustle an IndyCar around a street circuit. And we talked a lot about how that worked. And it's funny because that first year in IndyCar, I felt like a lot of people were asking stuff of me, right? They were asking for free passes and tickets and signed stuff. And I was like, I don't have stuff to give away because I'm using every piece of Nomex I own. I'm using every fire suit I own. They're like, oh, can I get a visor? I'm like, I'm trying to make one visor use all year. Cause like, I'm still like my first year, I'm still semi broke, right? I'm not like, I'm not making LeBron money here, right? I'm like just scraping by in IndyCar. And I was like, okay, like I'm sure they're going to want something for all this research, all this free knowledge. And we're sitting down and I remember you built this binder and I still have it on my bookshelf, built this binder of all, oh wait, you've got your copy. Of course you do. And so you hand this binder. Yeah, it's the Charlie Kimball book.
Yep.
It's the book of my body.
Yep.
And after reading through that, I go, okay, well, like, when's the other shoe going to drop, right? And Dr. Lightfoot looks at me and kind of sheepishly, I remember this, sheepishly looks at me and goes, so we're so grateful you came down and led your body to science for these 2 days. I think we'd love to work together in the future. I have a favor to ask. And I was like, all right, here it is. Here's the other shoe.
Here's
like,
what are
what pound of flesh are they going to take from me now? And he goes, so we've got this podcast and we'd love to have you on sometime in the next 3 months. We wouldn't keep you for more than 10 or 15 minutes. And we'll send you a t-shirt as a thank you. And I was like, wait, that's it? Like, I've just gotten all this information, right? I feel like I'm such a better prepared athlete heading into the off-season training and building for next year, and all they want's 10 minutes for a podcast. I think when I called into that podcast, we talked for like 45 minutes because it was such great conversation like this, right? Like every time we talk. And I remember leaving and I sent my dad all the data and he goes, whoa. He goes, I had no idea what I was sending you into, and I'm glad it was cool and helpful. So, and okay, but what did you, well, I've got okay, let me get back on track here because I've got a couple of questions. You know, since working with me and now a lot of other racing drivers, you started with that. I believe it was like heat sensitivity with NASCAR, correct? It was a temperature-based research project. You've written a few papers and a book. We talked about the science of motorsport. There's a chapter on me and my body in there. You've talked a lot about racing drivers as athletes. You know, I've got two questions here for you to answer.
Cool.
Title of the podcast is Speed Bumps. We got to talk about speed bumps. Were there any speed bumps along the way as you wrote those papers? And how has it gone? I remember you said Dr. Lightfoot was like, this research into motorsports is never going to be a full-time career. Has it become that? Have you gotten to live your passion with motorsports athletes?
Yeah. So the second question's easier to answer. Yes, I did it. It worked out. And we can talk about what that looks like and what we did. The speed bump question that's the fun question to answer, right? So, you know, I've thought about this many times over many years. That initial trip, your initial trip, is really what started all of this in my career. So in a way, thank you. You gave me my career. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, and I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, you know, so what kind of happened was, you're right. I did this project with NASCAR. It was not on drivers. It was on pit crews. It was looking at heat stress, and it was cool and it was fun. And, you know, everyone had kind of always said, racing's cool. Oh, that's cool. That's interesting. Good for you. But go do the adult work now. It was kind of like, go do the real science.
Right.
And you came out and you know, I'm an individual that I really like working with very high performing individuals like yourself, like people that really force me to think and do things. And let's be honest, there were times you asked me hard questions where you're like, what do I need to do, A or B? Because we're going to go try and win the Indy 500. Yeah. And, you know, getting that type of engagement and stimulation, having to think about those questions is fun for me. And like, that's why I have a PhD. That's why I do what I do. So, you know, your first trip, we talked a lot, and I think we kind of left, you say you left with a lot of good data, which is great, but I think we also left with a lot of questions.
Absolutely.
And I had to really sit down and start to think about, okay, how do you do this? How do you set up someone, and I'm going to use, we talk about using terms correctly. How do you, you know, prepare a race car driver that happens to have type 1 diabetes, not a type 1 diabetic race car driver? That's the first thing I learned when I first met you. And it turned out just to be a variable we have to consider. And, you know, the traditional academic pursuit would be, well, go to the literature, see what's been done, use that knowledge and apply it. There's no literature. Like, it's true. There is no data out there. Like, we're sitting here in 2024 and there's going to be probably 400 papers published on like football players. There are 40 published on race car drivers, period. Right. And if we want to talk about the
400 a year,
400 a year in football, 40 on race car drivers.
Total.
And if I want to,
how many of those 40 have your name somewhere in the byline?
Half of them.
Okay. So we could confidently say the resource on academic medical publications on motorsports athletes has Dr. David Ferguson attached to them.
We could say that. I don't like to be that egotistical, but
I will say that. I'll say that for you.
Yeah.
I'll say it for you, David.
So, way back in 2011, I was like, well, then I got to write these papers. If there's nothing out there, we got to write it. And I've got this great driver that seems pretty interested. I can use him. We could work together to do this, not use.
Yeah, use sounds a little one-sided. We worked together. I got as much out of it.
So, you talk about speed bumps. So I've now been an academic getting close to my 20-year mark. I've been doing this a long time, and I will probably till the day I die say that the paper we did on you is the best science I've ever done. It's when I felt like the most real science, most scientific person, because you had a problem that could not easily be solved, and you had to not only figure out how to do it, you had to invent all the ways to do it. And so we looked at everything from G tolerance, aerobic capacity, strength, all this stuff, and we put it in it. The paper has multiple years of data, and it was so fun to do. And I'll never forget when we finally finished it and I went to go publish it. So probably your audience doesn't know how you publish an academic paper. This is a good thing for me to say, but there are journals, and they are peer-reviewed journals. What that means is you submit your paper, and experts in whatever field you're in are going to review them and usually give you feedback. So they'll be like, okay, this is interesting. This is a novel topic. Ooh, I don't like how you did this method. Why didn't you do this? Or think about this. It's usually constructive. It's usually some form of, well, could you add this? Could you look at this? And you get a chance to revise it. And so I was all excited. My best science I've ever done. We're going to do this. And I remember I submitted to a fairly good journal that's kind of like the Exercise Physiology Home Journal. I probably shouldn't name them on this, but that's okay. Submitted it, and in under 24 hours, got rejected, saying that, thank you very much, but our journal is focused on sport athletes or exercise, and race car drivers don't fit into that. And
so you wrote a paper
Yep.
that took multiple years of data
Yep.
and multiple different factors and evolved the research protocols based on me
Yep.
as on my unique physiology
Yep.
and the unique elements of challenge as a racing driver within IndyCar with type 1. And they liked the science. They just said it doesn't fit our journal because racing drivers aren't athletes.
Pretty much. Yep.
So what did you do then?
So we talk about speed bumps, right? And when you approach a speed bump in life, you can do a couple things. You can just stop and not move forward, right? You can proceed with caution. You kind of go over it slowly. You could say the heck with it and go full throttle and just launch over the speed bump. Or, we like cars. There are now cars that have lifts that can lift it up. You can have your people that help you to kind of help you get over it. So I kind of approached the let's lift each other up, but I was also in my younger years, I did more of the full throttle experience. We're gonna go do this, and we're gonna do this.
Yeah.
So what happened kind of in an intermediate, I said, fine, I'll just go to a different journal, and submitted to it. And I got the same response, and so I actually replied back, and I said, what constitutes, you saying they're not athletes? Because we have data on them in the car. We can talk to them about what they're doing. How is this different? And they said, athletes are defined on physiological and psychological benchmarks that exceed that of what the average population does, with special applications to their exact sport.
Okay.
You have no data
I understand that.
Yeah, you have no data that says that. So I said, okay.
And again, we talked about there was no prior publication that stipulated that.
Yeah. Right. So this is actually a good connection. I'm not sure if you know this story. So through your sister, who I met at the Detroit Grand Prix once and was working with the Mercedes Formula One team in, it was PR, I think, or something like
event management.
Event management. So she introduced me to someone named Aki Kensa, who is this, he's sadly no longer with us, but this authority on driver medicine, driver performance. And he had at one time was kind of taking care of all the F1 drivers.
Right.
And so through them made some contact with his organization. So I said, when I got that email back, I said, all right, we're going to go write the book on what a driver athlete looks like. So, I reached out to them. I kind of started talking to people I know, and I said, we're going to go get people from F1, IndyCar, sports car, and NASCAR, and we're going to basically kind of do like the football combine. We're going to assess their physical performance. And we're going to write this paper that shows not only are they athletes, but they're, far exceeding whatever you consider to be an athlete. So we did this study, and I submitted that paper back to the original journal I submitted to that said not athletes. And so I sent it in there, and you write a cover letter that kind of says why you should be in there. And usually it's like a summary of your results. Dear editor, thank you for the opportunity to submit your work.
Yeah.
So I wrote, dear editor, thank you for motivating me to research an undocumented area of how race car drivers are athletes. I've taken your advice to heart. I now present quantifiable, undeniable data that shows race car drivers exceed the metrics for physical attributes of athletes in soccer, hockey, and the NASA space program. I welcome any feedback you may have. And they accepted it. So that was kind of the start. So
once you had that stipulated, then you could resubmit your original and say, well, now it works in your journal because racing drivers are athletes. You've stipulated it.
Yeah, here it is. And they accepted it. We got your paper eventually accepted. And then you kindly mentioned my book that we wrote. The book was done as kind of a complement to those papers because most people that actually needed this information weren't going to the scientific literature. They're kind of, they're coaches, they're trainers, they're drivers that just want something that has more of a narrative read. I'm a nerd. Right. It's boring to read scientific papers. So I wrote a little bit more of a narrative. But yeah, so that's how we did it. I still kind of chuckle as I've gotten older of like, ooh, you were pretty bold the way you just went full throttle at that. I think you may have made a comment to me about that at one point as well. But yeah, but it took that brash level to try and shake the field to say, you need to pay attention to this.
Well, and as a motorsport athlete, as a racing driver myself, I think we all appreciate because for years, I remember in high school, I was racing go-karts and cars after I got my driver's license at 16. And people said, well, you're not an athlete. Like, and I won't debate sports and what are athletes and what are not. But for the longest time, people are like, oh, IndyCar drivers, they're not athletes. And then you go, well, we don't have power steering.
Yep.
And because of the adrenaline, our heart rate runs at 160 to 180 for 3.5 hours, burn 2,000 calories, lose 10 pounds in body weight, have the G tolerance of the Apollo astronauts, thanks to your research, have the cardiovascular endurance of ice hockey players and soccer players, and the power to stand on a brake without power assist brakes and stop that car from 200 miles an hour to 50 miles an hour to go through a corner.
Yeah.
And now that you have published that paper, there is that empirical data. It's hard to argue with the data when you say, okay, here's the math. Like the laws of physics don't change. I trusted my life to the laws of physics going through turn one at Indy for a lot of years.
Yes.
And so it's nice to have, I think for us as athletes, to have that ability to say, no, like the same people, the same academic institutions that have written papers on, not an English major, have written papers on athletes And those same medical journals have stipulated that racing drivers are athletes. And here's the data why. Okay, I got a couple quick questions for you.
Go for it.
You once told my wife, and not me, I think you wanted my helmet to continue to fit, that me competing in IndyCar was like running a marathon with only one lung.
Absolutely.
In a couple of minutes, what do you mean by that and why?
So I think, so your wife is lovely. And so her and I would often talk about kind of what you were going through, try to, optimize your performance. And she was always interested in this stuff as well. She kind of has a bit of a mathematical background in her own way, and so was kind of interested in some of the stuff we were doing. And, one of the things I realized that I was always trying to explain to people that didn't really know what type 1 was how important it is to get glucose into the muscle. And, I think I was trying to articulate to Kathleen about, what I'm trying to convince people to hear. And she knew quite well what type 1 was. And so she was always trying to help me articulate those things. Like, I think there was a time where it was the three of us. We were always trying to work just to try to elevate all things Charlie Kimball, which was a lot of fun. And she said, "Oh, is it like trying to run a marathon with asthma?" And I was like, "No, because, if you don't have the insulin, the glucose isn't getting the muscle, much like oxygen's not even getting into the lung." So I was like, it's closer to like only having half a lung. And so it was trying to make an analogy of how serious it is to your performance that you get glucose into the muscle and it's the right amount in the right time, which was all the stuff we had worked on earlier on to get there.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Now zooming out a little bit, you work in human performance, both on a cellular, molecular, genetic level, and through research with individuals with real world applications. You have multiple research projects going on. What's your current perspective on human performance in general, and specifically the human ability and human performance ability to overcome challenges and speed bumps to be successful?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a great question, Charlie.
Hard-hitting podcast here, Speed Bumps with Charlie.
It really is. I'm going to say the questions are still kind of the same. How do you make someone go fast? How do you make someone fatigue less? How do you, get that extra 1/10 of a second here? And I mean, we talked about that. What we talked about in 2011, I'm still talking to drivers about. The thing that has changed for me is the tools to answer those questions have now changed. The technology has become much more streamlined, much smaller, much lighter. And we talked about AI a little bit early on. The analysis tools have changed. We did a pretty heavy statistics project with you and your data. And that was me crunching numbers in a kind of a pretty clunky stat software. Now, due to AI and kind of open source stuff, you can get programs that will do amazing things with your data that you don't really have to really do much with. It's very much more point, click, and go. So what I'm finding I'm having to teach my students is, you can use those tools, but don't forget garbage in, garbage out. Know what you're looking for and know what you're doing it with. So, and because of that, especially in motorsports, we kind of accomplished something, Charlie. Like, people now consider drivers athletes. You look at anywhere in motorsports, you see them training, nutrition, all this stuff. But there is I don't want to say a lot. There is a group that, is maybe putting misinformation out there now. So, they're using these very powerful tools, but not really knowing how to use them and giving incorrect information. So kind of where my stuff is going now is trying to be an advocate and educate people on, let's use these tools correctly. Much like you would tell me never to climb in an Indy car because I could do some damage. I'm saying, don't use these tools without fully understanding what they can do.
And understanding that it's the output is really, the tool is just a tool, right? It is
Yeah.
a blunt instrument. It is, you put good data in, you get good results out. You put incorrect or poor data in, you get incorrect or poor
Absolutely.
information on the backside. Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
Before we get to our 3 rapid fire every guest to speed bump questions, what would you say the biggest speed bump, personally or professionally, you've had to overcome to be successful? I mean, 20 years in academia now, a PhD, lots of letters after your name, whole alphabet soup there. Working with great athletes, working with great professors and colleagues, working all over the world in motorsports and in other labs, speaking on the topic, influencing safety and policy within sports. What are something you look back and go, man, I wasn't sure that I was going to get over that. And now that I have, I'm really proud of what I've done since.
So if I can short it to, can I say 2 things? 2 things I'll take.
You're my guest. You keep talking.
Thank you, sir. So, looking back on my career and my personal life, like, yeah, there's ups, downs, things that suck, and you kind of got to get through them. Doing a PhD is hard work. Anyone I meet, I'll definitely tell that. But I always love the projects. So the speed bumps for me were when the projects could have been taken away from me and I didn't want them to go. So I have 2 examples. One was kind of a internal deal. One was more of an external. The internal one was, I don't want to make this too much of a downer with the podcast, is if you're in the racing long enough, you're going to see drivers get hurt. Some get hurt pretty severely. And
it's not a risk-free sport. It's not a risk-free industry.
It's gotten a lot safer since the 70s, but it's not perfect. Right. Personally, I was not ready to really experience that. And so I had friends. We are friends. You work with people long enough, they become your friends, get hurt. And I really had to reconcile, if I wanted to keep doing this, I don't have to be okay with it, but I can't let it stop me from doing my job. And I have to be willing to help them do what they want to continue to do.
Wow, I'm actually going to stop you there, because that
really it gave me goosebumps. Firstly, secondly, I think as athletes and as the drivers ourselves, we understand the risks and we understand the benefit, right? We get to go out and live our dreams and go really, do what we want in a race car. And there are a lot of times we don't stop and think about the effects on those around us, right? Our friends, our loved ones, our spouses, our parents, our kids eventually. And to hear you talk about it is really interesting. Really interesting. And I guess maybe I hadn't considered that. I had never considered that perspective from someone like you who does research and has friends that are drivers and watches on TV. And I get it, because I go to football games I went to football games when I had friends playing, and I was like, oh, yeah, it was a big hit, I hope he gets up. Not, oh man, he threw a turnover or whatever. Like, it was just like, oh, like that perspective flips 180. And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no. And I think, I never really thought about it. In fact, I don't think you and I ever talked about, well, what happens if you get hurt or not? Like, it's one of those things of when it happens, you're there, you experience a wide variety of emotions. And for me, they're all very negative. And there's all, which as they should be, like, you should not be happy in this.
Right.
But,
right.
I really, right. I had to really reconcile of, if I'm going to do this, I don't have to be okay with it, but I'm going to keep trying to help these individuals. And I've sort of shifted my work also to include some safety stuff. So what came out of this was, we developed some new technology to monitor the drivers to kind of keep them safe and everything. So that was one speed bump. The other speed bump is, if you're in any career long enough, you're going to have bad experiences you're going to have to go through. And in the research world, our integrity is our research integrity, right? If you do research misconduct, if you make data up, if you do something like that, it's career over, it's done. And we take a lot of pride in that. And unfortunately, I've worked with amazing people, great students, great individuals, but not everything works out perfectly every time. I had a student, accuse me of research misconduct that resulted in a 1.5 year investigation that was horrible to go through. It was miserable. I was cleared of everything. Like they went through everything in my life basically and said, actually, no misconduct was done. You're completely good. Go back to your job.
So what you're saying is those investigators now know my name because there's been
They
a
do.
lot of research.
They do.
Okay. All right.
I will.
Well, I'm glad to hear they've cleared it. We've talked about this off
Yep.
the air, obviously, over the last couple of months, the last couple of years, as this process happened, and I'm glad it's
Yep.
resolved. Looking back on that situation and that process, does it change your perspective on the work you do?
Absolutely. The one thing I realized was that while this was one student that did one thing, I've got amazing students that do amazing things. And, I kind of had this realization that because I was kind of involved in an investigation, I couldn't be at the racetrack doing things, and my students were doing more. And it gave me an amazing level of fulfillment when they sort of took ownership of this. They were kind of like me, going to the track. They were doing this stuff. And again, through you, it's still kind of odd of you came out to a PhD student that had an idea. And, I had to kind of think like, wow, Charlie trusted me as a PhD student. I'm going to let other drivers trust my students. And I let them go do it. And now I sit at the desk more often than I should. That's why I've got a belly growing here I need to work on. Well, but it was a great reflection and mentoring experience. I really had to lean on them this time. They really rose to the occasion. I will be internally indebted to them for it. But it kind of led to a different way of the way I do things now where, we're getting older, Charlie, but we're not old yet. Where my role is now shifting up. It's my time to start training the next generation to go do this. David doesn't need to be running around the racetrack anymore, but there are people like Abby and Aiden who, unfortunately, you haven't met, but I'd love for them to meet you, that they're going to go do this stuff now. So, I guess, thank you for my slight therapy session here, Charlie, of talking about things that were not great. But what kind of came out of it is, I really kind of had to learn I'm going to modify how I do things. I'm going to modify my work approach. And at the end of the day, drivers are still going to be healthy and safe. We're still going to accomplish that. But now I feel really confident that at whatever point when I'm no longer doing this, there are others trained out there doing it. And then I won't have half the publications. There'll be other people out there.
Well, that's fantastic to build for the next generation.
Yeah.
All right. We're getting close on time. And if possible, I'd like to reserve the right to recall you as a future guest, because we didn't even get to talk about the LBNP and G tolerance and some of the really cool tests we've done. So I'll reserve that right. But
you got it.
I like to ask all my guests here on the podcast sort of 3 rapid fire questions. Mm-hmm. So first up, what's the best advice you've ever gotten and from whom?
The best advice I've ever gotten, so probably came from my dad. So my dad was a professor and an academic. And when I kind of went down this path, he always encouraged me to, pursue what you're passionate about, be thorough, do it with integrity, and trust your gut. So that was kind of probably the best advice I've ever gotten. It fits into a lot of the things I've done, but yeah, absolutely came from my dad.
Okay. And then what's your dream car if you had this car in your garage, it would be perfect. And do you have a plan to get it if you don't have it already?
I've got one right now that is pretty cool. I like us pretty well. The dream car would be a 1966 Ford GT40.
All right. Okay. All right. So keeping an eye on Craigslist for that then.
Yeah. I got to do a lot more to get there. I think they're going in the $20 million range right now. So
yeah, a little bit more. Now you've gotten to go cool places as athletes. We get to go cool places, meet cool people, have really great interactions. What's the most interesting, coolest, memorable, personal interaction, conversation, meeting other than me than you've ever had?
So you kind of got me off the knees there, Charlie, because anytime I answer this question, I say you when we talk about all our stories.
So other than me,
other than you, I got to speak to Roger Penske for 2 minutes, and I kind of was able to tell him what I do. And he's like, wow, that's really interesting. And then he kind of asked me a question about some of the other detail stuff, and that was really amazing. But that was a 2-minute conversation. As for like just really interesting, in-depth conversations of learning wild stuff, sitting with Aki Hinsa at the U.S. Grand Prix at Coda and asking all the questions that have kind of been in my head about motorsports, because I was still, this would have been 2013, I think. Like I was still kind of early stages of doing this, and having him share his ideas, confirming things I thought were right, saying things, no, that's wrong. It was eye-opening. We're at a loss and he's no longer with us, but oh my gosh, that was amazing.
Fantastic. Dr. Ferguson, thank you for your time. We always have great conversations. I seem to learn something every time. For our audience listening or watching, please check out The Science of Motorsport. It's an incredible book that Dr. Ferguson wrote. A lot of his research on racing drivers as athletes is in there, as he said it in narrative form. You can search his name with all those PhD letters after it and find a lot of the journal publications he's done within motorsports. And as a researcher at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and then at Texas A&M, and now at Michigan State, I've been really fortunate to work with you. Thank you so much for all the knowledge over the years. Like I said, I'm reserving the right to recall you as another future guest here on Speed Bumps with Charlie Kimball. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe so you can keep up to speed with me and this podcast.